I used to think life had already written my ending. The pages were yellowing, the ink faded, and the story, mine, had grown dull, filled with long pauses and quiet sighs. People around me spoke as if I'd reached the final chapter years ago. "You've done enough, Harold," they'd say. "Just rest. Watch TV. Don't push yourself." They meant well, I think. But every time I heard those words, something deep inside me crumbled. Not because they were wrong, but because I had started to believe them. I was 73 when I realized I'd been living in the waiting room of my own life, waiting for something that would never come unless I stood up and walked out the door to find it. My wife, Clara, had passed away 3 years earlier. My children were busy, my friends fewer than before, and my days revolved around coffee, television, and the same park bench outside my apartment building. That bench had become both my companion and my confession booth. I'd sit there every morning, watch the joggers, the young couples, the kids chasing pigeons, and I'd whisper to myself, "You had your turn, old man." But one crisp autumn morning, something shifted. Maybe it was the sound of laughter that cut through the wind. A group of art students painting the sunrise across the lake. Or maybe it was the little boy who tripped and fell, only to get back up with a smile, brushing off his knees, as if pain didn't matter. I don't know what exactly triggered it, but I felt a spark, faint but undeniable. That evening, I found an old photo album tucked away in a dusty box. Between the worn pages, I saw the young man I once was, standing beside a rusty motorbike, camera slung over his shoulder, eyes bright with dreams. I'd wanted to travel the world, to photograph stories that words couldn't tell. But then came bills, responsibilities, the steady rhythm of ordinary life. I'd traded my dreams for stability, and by the time I realized it, I'd convinced myself it was too late to change. That night, as rain tapped gently on my window, I whispered to Clara's photograph, "You remember that road trip we never took? The one through the mountains? I think I'm going to do it." The next morning, I pulled out a map, an actual paper one, not the glowing kind on a phone, and traced a route with trembling fingers. From my small town in Indiana to the Rockies, through winding roads and quiet towns, across bridges I'd only seen in postcards. The thought of it scared me, not because of the distance, but because of the whispers I could already hear from everyone around me. When I told my daughter, she laughed, not cruelly, but in disbelief. "Dad, you can't be serious. You can barely walk up the stairs without getting winded. What if something happens to you out there?" I smiled, not with defiance, but with quiet determination. "Something already is happening," I told her. "I'm still alive." The following week, I sold a few old things, packed my camera, a small suitcase, and my memories, and set out in my old pickup truck. The engine sputtered, the tires groaned, but the moment the open road stretched before me, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: freedom. The first stop was a small diner off Highway 36. The waitress, a woman in her 30s, looked surprised when I asked for a black coffee and a slice of apple pie. "You traveling alone, sir?" she asked. "Yes," I said with a grin. "Just me, my camera, and a bit of foolishness." She laughed softly. "Foolishness is underrated. Most people forget how to dream once they grow up." Her words stayed with me as I drove through endless fields, mountains rising in the distance like promises. I stopped often, sometimes to take photos, sometimes just to breathe. I captured barns leaning into time, rivers shimmering with light, children waving from porches, and old couples holding hands like the world still made sense. At one point, I met a young hitchhiker named Leo. He carried a guitar, wore a jacket patched with dreams, and had eyes full of questions. "You really driving across the country at your age?" he asked, as we shared a sandwich by the roadside. "At my age?" I chuckled. "Son, age is just the number of times the sun's given you a chance to start again." He stared at me, thoughtful, and then said, "That's the most beautiful thing I've heard all week." We drove together for a few days, talking about life, regret, and the spaces between. He reminded me of myself once, restless, uncertain, searching for something unnamed. When we parted ways near Colorado Springs, he hugged me tight. "You made me believe I can still do something with my life," he said. I smiled, feeling the weight of years fall from my shoulders. "We both just did, kid." That night, I camped under the stars for the first time in over 40 years. The sky stretched endlessly, filled with constellations Clara used to name for me when we were young. I whispered her name again and imagined her laughter carried by the wind. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. I felt alive. I thought of all the people who had told me I was too old to start over. Maybe they were right about the body. It aches, it slows, it forgets. But the soul doesn't age. It waits patiently for the moment we stop listening to fear and start listening to that quiet, stubborn voice that says, "You're not done yet." And for me, that voice had finally won. By the time I reached the base of the Rocky Mountains, my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from awe. The world around me was vast and alive in ways I'd forgotten it could be. I parked the truck at a lookout point, stepped out, and the wind hit me with a chill so sharp it made my eyes water. Below me stretched miles of pine forests and winding rivers, each glinting like silver threads in the late afternoon Sunday. For a while, I just stood there, breathing, letting the cold air sting my lungs. My knees hurt, my back ached, but I didn't care. Every pain was proof that I was still here, still trying, still dreaming. I found a small lodge nearby, the kind with creaky floors, a log fireplace, and a guest book filled with scribbles from travelers passing through. The woman who ran the place, Martha, must have been in her late 60s. When I told her I was driving alone, she raised an eyebrow but smiled. "You've got spirit," she said. "Most folks your age don't go beyond their mailbox." I laughed. I got tired of waiting for life to come to me. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. That night, I sat by the fire while the logs crackled and shadows danced across the wooden walls. A young couple sat nearby, their faces glowing with the kind of love that's both fragile and fierce. Watching them made me think of Clara again, how we used to sneak out to the lake at midnight, how she'd whisper plans about growing old together. We had, in our own way, but I realize now that growing old doesn't have to mean growing still. Clara would have loved this adventure. She used to say, "You only stop living when you stop wondering." And sitting there, I wondered about everything. The roads ahead, the strangers I'd meet, the lessons still waiting for me. The next morning, I set out early, the sky painted with streaks of gold and pink. I turned on the radio, and an old jazz tune filled the cabin of my truck. I couldn't help it. I started tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, humming along. For the first time in years, I wasn't just moving. I was dancing with life again. Somewhere near a small mountain town, I stopped at a cafe built inside a converted train car. The barista, a girl with blue hair and bright eyes, noticed my camera. "You a photographer?" she asked. "Used to be," I said, trying to remember how. She smiled. "Then you still are. The lens doesn't care about time." Her words lingered with me. After coffee, I wandered into the streets, old brick buildings, colorful murals, and local shops selling handmade crafts. One painting caught my eye in a window. An elderly man sitting on a dock, gazing at the horizon, his reflection stretching into eternity. The caption beneath it read, "It's never too late to start over." I went inside, met the artist, a man in his 50s named Raymond. We talked for over an hour about art, loss, and how time changes everything but meaning. "You've got stories in your eyes," he said to me. "Ever thought of sharing them?" I told him I didn't know how anymore. He handed me a small notebook. "Start with one sentence. That's how all stories begin." That night, in the dim glow of my motel room, I opened the notebook and wrote, "I thought my life had ended when I turned 70, but I was wrong. It was just beginning." The words came slowly at first, then faster, pouring out like a river that had been dammed for years. I wrote about Clara, about my children, about the loneliness that had once felt permanent, and then about this journey, the laughter, the roads, the faces of strangers who reminded me that kindness still existed. When I put the pen down, I realized it wasn't just a story I was writing. It was a confession, a rediscovery. Maybe that was the real purpose of this trip, not just to see the world again, but to see myself in it. A few days later, I reached a viewpoint high above a valley. The air was thin, and I could feel my heart working harder than it used to. But when I looked down and saw the river snaking through the trees, glistening under the sun, I felt young again. I took a deep breath and lifted my camera. Click. The sound was like music. I'd captured thousands of photos in my life, but this one felt different. It wasn't about composition or light or perfection. It was about truth. The truth that I was still capable of seeing beauty, not as something distant, but as something alive inside me. On my way back to the truck, I met a group of hikers resting near the trailhead. One of them, a man in his 20s, offered me a bottle of water and said, "You're an inspiration, sir. My grandpa says he's too old to travel now, but you're proving him wrong." I smiled. "Tell your grandpa he's wrong about that. The only thing too old to dream is regret." He laughed and nodded. "I'll tell him that." As I drove away, I thought about all the people who'd told me to slow down, to accept my limits, to act my age. Maybe they were afraid, not of age itself, but of what it revealed. That the walls they'd built around themselves weren't protection, but prisons. When night fell, I parked by a lake and built a small fire. The reflection of the flames shimmered across the water, and I felt the old ache in my chest. The one that comes when you realize you've wasted too much time worrying about how little time you have left. But instead of sadness, I felt peace. Because now, I was using that time. I was doing the one thing people my age often forget how to do. I was living. I took out the notebook again and wrote another line. Maybe youth isn't a season of life. Maybe it's the courage to start something new. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel like an old man. I felt like a man reborn. A week into my journey, I started noticing something strange. The further I traveled, the lighter I felt, not just in body, but in spirit. It was as if every mile I drove peeled away a layer of the weight I'd carried for years. The guilt, the regrets, the endless what-ifs, they began to dissolve in the rearview mirror. One morning, I stopped at a farmer's market in a small riverside town. The place was alive with color. Baskets of peaches, sunflowers swaying in the breeze, children laughing as they chased each other between stalls. I bought a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of honey from an elderly couple who reminded me of myself and Clara. The woman, her hair silver and eyes gentle, asked where I was headed. "Anywhere I haven't been yet," I said with a grin. She chuckled. "That's a fine destination. My husband and I always said we'd travel after retirement. But life has a way of changing your plans, doesn't it?" I nodded. "It does. That's why I stopped waiting." Her husband leaned in. "Good. Don't ever wait too long, son. Time doesn't slow down for anyone, but you can still make it chase you." His words stuck with me as I sat by the river, tearing pieces of bread and watching ducks drift by. I realized that, for years, I'd been waiting for permission to be happy, to dream again, to move forward. But no one gives that permission. You have to take it yourself. That afternoon, I drove until the sun began to dip behind the hills. I reached a coastal town that smelled of salt and wind. I booked a small room overlooking the ocean and spent the evening walking along the shore, letting the cold waves lap at my feet. The sand was damp and firm beneath me, and the horizon stretched endlessly. I thought about Clara again. We used to talk about retiring near the sea, about mornings spent walking hand in hand along a beach like this. Life hadn't given me that, but maybe, in this moment, I was keeping that promise in my own way. The next morning, as I was loading my truck, a young man approached me. He looked about 30, with a worn backpack and tired eyes. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "You heading north?" "I might be," I replied cautiously. "My car broke down, and I'm trying to get home to see my mom. She's sick." Something in his voice felt genuine, that quiet desperation you can't fake. I nodded. "Hop in." We talked for hours as the road stretched ahead of us. His name was Ethan, and he'd been drifting from job to job, trying to figure out where he fit in the world. He told me he'd been too proud to ask for help until now. "You remind me of myself," I said. "Except I didn't realize I needed help until it was too late." He glanced at me. "You? You seem like you've got it all figured out." I laughed. "Son, I'm 80 years old, living out of a truck, talking to strangers on the highway. The only thing I've figured out is that nobody ever really does." He smiled. "That's actually comforting." We stopped at a diner for lunch, the kind with red leather booths and a jukebox that still took quarters. As we ate, Ethan asked, "What made you start traveling now?" I stirred my coffee. "Because I was tired of being told who I was supposed to be. Old, fragile, finished. I wanted to prove them wrong, not for them, but for me." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's brave." "Not brave," I said. "Just overdue." When we reached his hometown that evening, he insisted on paying for gas. "You didn't have to stop for me," he said. "But you did. My mom's gonna be so happy to see me." "Take care of her," I said. "You don't get second chances with mothers." He nodded, and before he walked away, he handed me something, a small worn bracelet made of leather. "I've had this since I was a kid. For luck. You'll need it on the road." I turned it over in my hand, the leather warm from his touch. "Thank you, son." As I drove away, I saw him running up the path toward a small house where a woman stood waiting on the porch. She opened her arms wide as he ran into them, and I felt something ache in my chest, that bittersweet reminder of what it means to come home. The bracelet stayed on my wrist from that day on. Maybe it was superstition, maybe it was hope, but something about it made me feel like I was part of a bigger story again. A few days later, I stopped at a viewpoint overlooking the cliffs. The sea below roared and crashed with untamed power, spraying mist high into the air. A few tourists stood nearby, snapping photos with their phones. One of them, a teenage girl, noticed my old camera. "Whoa, that's vintage," she said. "Does it still work?" I smiled. "Better than I do, some days." She laughed and asked if she could take a photo of me. I agreed, and she snapped one. Me standing against the wind, the ocean stretching behind, the leather bracelet visible on my wrist. When she showed me the picture, something about it made me pause. The man in that frame, lined face, silver hair, but eyes still alive. He didn't look like someone waiting for the end. He looked like someone who'd just begun again. That night, as I watched the sunset from the cliff's edge, I thought about all the people who'd told me I was too old to dream, too weak to try, and I realized they were never really talking about me. They were talking about their own fears, their own limitations. The truth is, people project their own surrender onto others. But dreams don't have expiration dates. They only fade if you stop feeding them. I closed my eyes, felt the wind brush against my face, and whispered, "I'm not done yet." And I meant it. The next leg of my journey took me inland, through winding forest roads that smelled of pine and rain. I passed through small towns where everyone seemed to know everyone else. In one of those towns, I stopped to rest at a local cafe. It was quiet, the kind of place that played soft jazz and served pie that tasted like it was made with love, not recipes. As I sat by the window sipping my coffee, a woman about my age approached. She carried herself with the kind of grace that comes from surviving a few storms in life. "Mind if I sit?" she asked with a gentle smile. "Not at all," I said. Her name was Grace. Fitting, really. We started talking about the weather, but conversation soon drifted to deeper things. Family. Loss. The strange ache of time. I told her about Clara, about how I'd spent years in a house filled with echoes. She listened quietly, her eyes soft. Then she said, "You know, I lost my husband 10 years ago. After that, I stopped doing all the things we used to dream about. Traveling, painting, living. I thought those dreams belonged to us, not me." I nodded. "That's exactly how I felt," she smiled faintly. "But lately, I've been wondering maybe the best way to honor what we had isn't to stop living, but to live twice as hard." Her words lingered. We spent hours talking, laughing at silly things, sharing memories that hurt but also healed. It felt easy, natural, like we'd known each other for years. When I finally stood to leave, she reached into her bag and handed me a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" I asked. "Just a quote I keep with me," she said. "It's helped me through dark times. Maybe it'll help you too." I didn't read it until I was back in my truck, parked beneath the fading sunset. The paper read, "When nothing is certain, anything is possible." I smiled, folded it carefully, and tucked it into my journal. Days turned into weeks as I kept moving. Every town, every face, added something to my journey. There was the mechanic in Montana who refused to take payment after fixing my tire, said it was an old man discount. There was the widow in Nebraska who invited me to dinner because she couldn't stand eating alone. There were the kids in Kansas who begged me to tell them stories about the old days, and the teacher in New Mexico who made me promise to send her a postcard from wherever I went next. Each encounter stitched me back together, thread by thread. It was as if the world, piece by piece, was reminding me I still mattered. But life has a way of testing resolve just when you start to feel steady again. It happened one evening on a quiet mountain road. Rain was pouring hard and the fog was thick. I was driving slower than usual, when a sudden figure appeared on the road, a deer, frozen in my headlights. I swerved, the truck skidding on the slick asphalt, and everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital bed. My leg was in a cast, and the room smelled of disinfectant and stale air. A nurse entered, smiling gently. "You're lucky, sir," she said. "A local woman found your truck in a ditch and called for help." "Was anyone hurt?" I asked, panicked. "Just you," she said. "But you'll recover. You've got a strong heart for 80. A few hours later, the door opened, and to my surprise, it was Grace. She walked in holding flowers and a thermos. "You didn't think you'd get rid of me that easily, did you?" I laughed, though it hurt a bit. "How did you find me?" "You told me you were heading north. When I heard about an old man in a red truck in an accident, I figured it had to be you." She stayed for days, bringing soup and company. We played cards, watched old movies, and talked about everything under the Sunday And in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the soft hum of machines, I realized something I hadn't dared to think before. Maybe my journey wasn't meant to be walked alone after all. When I was discharged, Grace offered to drive me to her home until I healed. I wanted to refuse, pride, habit, fear, but she insisted. Her house was small but full of warmth, with shelves of books and a garden that smelled of lavender and life. We settled into a quiet rhythm. Mornings were for coffee and crossword puzzles. Afternoons, we'd sit in the garden, talking or just watching the world move. She'd paint while I read, and sometimes we'd just sit in silence, a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. One day, as the sun set in streaks of gold and crimson, she said softly, "You know, you've got that look in your eyes again." "What look?" "The one that says you're dreaming of the next road." I chuckled. "You're right, I guess the road calls me." She smiled knowingly. Then maybe it's time I answered it too. So, 2 weeks later, we packed her small car and set off together. Two souls in their twilight years chasing something that most people our age had stopped believing in: adventure. We drove through deserts and mountains, through towns so small they didn't even have names on the map. We watched the stars from the hood of the car, cooked simple meals over campfires, and talked about everything: love, loss, mistakes, forgiveness, the strange beauty of getting older. Somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about how much time I had left. I just lived. And that, I realized, was the secret all along. Life doesn't end when you grow old. It ends when you stop seeing possibility. We reached the ocean again by late spring. The air was warmer now, carrying the scent of salt and possibility. Grace parked the car near a cliff that overlooked miles of blue. The waves crashed below, strong and restless, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something that could only be described as alive. We sat in silence for a while, watching seagulls dance on the wind. Then Grace said quietly, "Do you ever think about how strange it is, all the years we spend worrying about things that don't really matter?" I nodded. Most of my life, I worried about work, money, reputation. Then, when I retired, I worried about being forgotten. But sitting here now, it all feels small. She smiled. Exactly. We spend decades chasing the wrong kind of success. And when we finally stop running, we realize the real prize was peace. There was something in her voice, a softness, a calm certainty that made me turn to look at her. The wind caught her hair, and for a moment, she looked timeless. I thought about how far I'd come from that empty house, from the man who thought his story was over. After a long pause, I said, "You know what's funny? Everyone told me I was too old to start over, too old to travel, to dream, to love again. But here I am, and I've never felt younger." She laughed, the sound bright against the crash of the waves. "That's because youth isn't a number. It's a state of rebellion against giving up." That night, we set up camp near the shore. The stars spread endlessly above us, and the fire crackled between our chairs. I pulled out my old journal, the same one I'd been writing in since the day I left home. The pages were filled with stories, reflections, and sketches of faces I'd met along the way. I flipped through them slowly, feeling gratitude spill through me like light. Grace noticed. "You've written a lot," she said softly. "Yeah. I guess I was trying to make sense of it all." She leaned closer. "And did you?" I smiled faintly. "Maybe the point isn't to make sense of life. Maybe it's just to live it, fully, Honestly, without apology. She reached over and took my hand. Then you've done that beautifully. We sat like that for a long time. No need for words, no need for more. Just two people who'd seen enough of life to know how precious silence can be. Over the next months, Grace and I kept traveling. We visited art museums in cities we couldn't pronounce, danced to street music in small towns, and ate meals with strangers who became friends. Everywhere we went, people were surprised and inspired. You too? They'd say, smiling. Traveling the country at your age? And we'd laugh. Age is just the number of years the world's been lucky enough to have us, Grace would reply. But life, as always, has its cycles, joy, loss, renewal. One morning, as the first chill of autumn brushed the air, Grace woke up coughing. At first, it seemed harmless, but soon it became clear something was wrong. The doctors said it was her lungs, fragile, tired. We stayed near a coastal town where the air was gentle and the sunsets looked like painted dreams. I sat by her side every day, reading aloud from our journals, recounting our adventures. She smiled through it all, her eyes still bright. One evening, as the light faded, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Promise me something, anything. Keep living. Don't stop when I'm gone. You've still got miles to go." I swallowed hard, my voice barely steady. "You'll always be part of those miles." She smiled, then closed her eyes. "Then that's enough." She passed quietly that night. The days that followed were heavy, but not empty. I buried her beneath a tree by the sea, a place she loved. On her gravestone, I carved the words she once gave me. "When nothing is certain, anything is possible." Afterward, I sat by her resting place for hours, the wind playing through the grass. I wasn't alone, not really. She was in the rhythm of the waves, in the laughter we'd shared, in the courage she'd helped me rediscover. Eventually, I packed the car and started driving again. The road stretched endlessly ahead, shimmering under the Sunday. I didn't know exactly where I was going, and for the first time, that felt right. I began to stop at schools and community centers, telling stories to anyone who would listen, young people, retirees, single parents, lost souls. I told them about Grace, about starting over, about how life doesn't end when your body grows old. It ends when your spirit stops reaching. One afternoon, after one of my talks, a young man approached me. He looked nervous but determined. "Sir," he said, "my father's about your age, but he's given up on everything. He says there's no point anymore. What should I tell him?" I smiled, feeling that old spark rise again. "Tell him this. The point isn't to have time left. It's to use the time you have left. To love, to forgive, to start again if he must. It's never too late to begin." The boy nodded, his eyes bright. "Thank you." That night, as I drove away, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The same wrinkles, the same gray hair. But behind those, I saw something new. A man who had finally understood that life's greatest journey begins when you stop fearing the end. When I pulled over to rest, I took out my journal once more and wrote the final line beneath hundreds of pages of memories. They said I was too old to dream, too weak to try. But I just started living the life I always wanted, and I wouldn't trade a single mile of it. Then I closed the book, leaned back, and let the sound of the ocean fill the night.